At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers from the National Taxpayers Union in the Washington, D.C. area. I am your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to our latest edition. You know, since this program airs on a Sunday afternoon, people are generally in a lighthearted, carefree mood. It's kind of hard to be that way in the current economy, but we all try, and so we here at Speaking of Taxpayers want to do our part with a, well, I think relevant joke for our times. It's concerning that recently passed $787 billion stimulus package, and the joke goes like this. There are 3 contractors bidding to fix a broken fence in the White House. One's from Chicago, another's from Tennessee, and the third is from Minnesota. Now, they all go with a White House official to examine the fence. The Minnesota contractor takes out a tape measure and does some measuring, works some figures with a pencil, and he says to the guy, "Well, I figure the job will run about $900. $400 for materials, $400 for my crew, and $100 profit for me." Well, up next is the Tennessee contractor who does the same measuring and figuring, and he says, "I can do this job for less, $700. That's $300 for materials, $300 for my crew, and $100 profit for me." Well, the last guy up is the Chicago contractor. Now, he doesn't do any measuring or figuring. He just leans over to the White House official and says, $2,700. The White House official, of course, is obviously surprised. That's a huge bid compared to the Minnesota and the Tennessee guy. The official says, "You didn't even measure like the other guys. How did you come up with such a high figure?" Well, the Chicago contractor leaned over again and whispered back, "Well, that's $1,000 for me, $1,000 for you, and we hire the guy from Tennessee to fix the fence." "Done," replies the government official, and that, dear listeners, is how the new stimulus plan could work. That joke, courtesy of the internet, been floating around everywhere, but I think it's a great illustration of the way some of the people out there are feeling about this stimulus package.
That's a good joke, Pete.
Well, thank you. Now, there's still this question about how much the stimulus package will actually cost America. The figure of $787 billion continues to be bandied about, but when you break it down and you look at the long-term consequences, it's a lot worse than that. Because all of this is going to consist of borrowed money, the federal government will have to pay debt service on the stimulus cash. That means as much as $300 billion over a 7 or 10-year period. So now we're already above $1 trillion as the true cost of the stimulus. Then there's the other component, the fact that many federal agencies are getting huge budget boosts in this stimulus package that are supposed to be temporary. But as we know, there's no such thing as a temporary program in Washington, D.C., and so many of us fear that these agencies that got a huge budget boost for 2009 and maybe 2010 will keep coming back year after year arguing, "I still want that level of funding, and if you give me less, you're cutting my budget," even though their budget is already bloated. That could add hundreds of billions of dollars more to the cost of this stimulus. A real problem, folks. And, well, we're going to have to deal with this stimulus package with more transparency. That's something we'll be discussing later with one of our colleagues from the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. But first and foremost, I think we can deal with some of the ethical dimensions of this stimulus package. Namely, are there pay-to-play schemes? Are there quid pro quos? In other words, spending tax money in exchange for political campaign contributions. At least one member of Congress has noticed that there's probably a connection here, and he wants to sever that connection. It's Congressman Jeff Flake of Arizona, and he has a new piece of legislation to close a loophole in House earmark accountability rules. As all of our listeners know, or most of them do, sadly, an earmark is a special interest spending provision inserted into a bill by a specific member of Congress.
While the 110th Congress, the previous Congress from this one, did make improvements to earmark disclosure, there are still loopholes that can be exploited by special interests. Current law requires that a member submitting an earmark request certify that he or she has no, quote, financial interest in the earmark, which is intended to prevent members from earmarking their own personal benefit, such as granting federal money to companies in which they are shareholders. But the House Ethics Manual specifically states that campaign contributions do not constitute a financial interest. HRES 85 would clarify the existing strictures to ensure that campaign contributions are indeed considered, quote, financial interests.
Boy, that would seem obvious common sense to most Gimme Radio listeners. Sure, you have a financial interest in passage of legislation if it will help your stock go up and you're on a company's board of directors, or you were on their board of directors. But one would think that the same would apply to campaign contributions. I mean, that's the kind of thing that got Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich in trouble. The fact that he was basically auctioning off state programs in exchange for campaign contributions. Seems illegal at the state level, that's why the guy's in trouble, but here in our United States Congress, it's business as usual. That's what House Resolution 85 is meant to change. So Gimme Radio listeners who want to improve the budget process should contact their lawmakers in support of this bill. How do they do that, Natasha?
Well, they can go to our website, www.ntu.org, and sign up for our Taxpayer Action Center, where they'll be directed to ways they can contact their representatives in Congress.
Fantastic. That's definitely legislation to work on this week. We may not have beaten the stimulus package in its entirety, but the fight goes on. We will not give up. House Resolution 85 is the number, folks. Remember to contact your member of Congress in favor of that bill. And remember, there is always hope. Never give up. And we're going to hear from a guy who's never given up in our next segment. And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, we're going to talk about see-through government. Now, don't sever those internet connections. This is a family show. Nothing strange going on here. Rather, it is the transparency movement, a way to give taxpayers new methods to see where government is spending their money and where government is wasting their money. And here we have the man with the X-ray vision to tell us how it's going to happen, Doug El-Sanati with the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Doug, when people talk about government transparency online, what exactly do they mean?
Transparency can really refer to a wide variety of topics, but what transparency is the manner in which government conducts itself and its processes. So, understanding transparency, or one way of approaching that is by thinking of its opposite. Is it cloudy? Are government processes covered, or are they readily accessible to taxpayers and easily understandable? So here at the National Taxpayers Union Foundation, when we think about transparency, we're referring to transparency in government spending. So does the government actually show taxpayers how it spends their money over time?
Okay. And why is transparency important for taxpayers?
Yeah, so there are two ways to answer that question. One is from the perspective of the taxpayer. The fundamental relationship between taxpayers and government officials or elected representatives is one of trust. So we as taxpayers have entrusted our money to those government representatives. And in that sense, it's important for us to see how well they are acting as stewards of our money. So that's one perspective, the taxpayer's perspective. We should be able to see how our money is being used. From the government perspective, officials and representatives are more responsible when they know that someone is evaluating and looking at how they're using taxpayer dollars. So that's a two-sided answer to the question.
Yeah, Doug, we've discovered that with NTU Foundation's bill tally system, in that it's not only something for taxpayers to read, but public officials themselves. In Congress, the bill tally system, which costs out every piece of legislation introduced on the federal level, it helps lawmakers manage their own agendas. If they're looking for ways to cut spending, they can access our database. If they're looking for ways to offset spending increases with decreases elsewhere, why they can do that. And with these new databases of government expenditures on the state and local level, it becomes much more possible, I would think, for government agency managers to start looking at the big picture of ways they might be able to economize, and equally important, talk with each other and try and save money. Do you agree?
Right. Yeah. That's right. And an example of that would be Texas. In January of 2007, Texas posted or launched a online spending database as a result of evaluating their own finances, so not just making them available to taxpayers, but making them more accessible within the different agencies. They were actually able to save over $4 million initially, and then anticipate savings of $3 million in the future. So that's a very tangible example of the benefit to government itself that accompanies transparency.
Okay. You mentioned Texas as one state that has online spending, an online spending database. What other states have created spending databases, or at least passed legislation to create these online websites?
Sure. Yeah, the list is not where we'd like it to be yet, because not all 50 states have done this, but it is growing. And so I'll just mention several of the states: Alabama, Georgia, Hawaii, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, New York, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Utah, and Washington State. So those are all different states that have either placed spending databases online or at least passed legislation to do so.
So Gimme Radio listeners, if you heard your state's name on that list, go find out the expenditures that government is making in your name. If you do not hear your state and you want to get involved in this movement, then you have to visit a new website we're setting up on this whole issue called Show Me the Spending. Well, it's not new, but it's new to you guys, which is what's important.
That's right. On showmethespending.com, it's possible for taxpayers to go and actually send letters to their representatives in government if their state is not transparent. So go visit showmethespending.com.
Okay, read that list again of states that do have transparency measures in place that allow citizens to see where their expenditures are going.
Right. And again, these are states that either have placed these records online or have legislation or an executive order in place. So for example, Utah does not have a website launched yet, but it will in the spring. And so some of these states have lists, but you can find out all that information on showmethespending.com. Alabama, Georgia, Hawaii, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, New York, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Utah, and Washington State.
Splendid.
And there are some states that are currently considering legislation to create these databases, aren't there, Doug?
There are. Some of those will be Oregon, Colorado, Virginia, Montana. And that leads into something else, another interesting aspect of transparency, as we've seen it unfold in the U.S., which is states which have passed legislation to create transparency, but haven't yet obeyed their own law and legislation.
Okay. So what states have passed legislation but not yet created the databases?
Right. So two that we focused on here are Minnesota and Hawaii. And they're both very interesting because they offer case studies almost, or examples of issues and obstacles, or perceived issues and obstacles, that government officials face when they're trying to create transparency in their states. So.
Okay.
In other words, they're saying, for example, well, this costs too much money, and in an era where we're pinching pennies in our budget everywhere, we can't afford the $1 million or $2 million or $5 million to set up this website for transparency. How would you respond to that argument in terms of, number one, are they really costing that much? Mm-hmm. And number two, are they not paying for themselves by revealing more savings throughout the government?
Right. Well, we referred to the example of Texas earlier, and that's Texas paid about just a little bit over $300,000 to get their transparency database online, and we already mentioned the $8 million in actually saved or anticipated savings over the next several years. But in that the case of Texas is actually a rarity. Georgia, Maryland, South Carolina, and South Dakota have all been able to launch these databases without any cost at all. No new appropriations, no new spending in that sense. In that sense, the sites were launched using existing resources. And then, Minnesota even is a great example. Like I said, in 2007, it passed legislation. The legislature passed a bill that mandated creation of a spending database in January of 2008. So we're in February now of 2009, and that site has not yet been launched. However, based on some research that I've been doing recently, I found out that the site is scheduled to be launched in the end of February or early March. The initial cost of that site was expected to be about $1 million, right? So that raised some big issues, especially in this fiscal environment.
Sure.
In fact, the site will be launched with expenses met with existing resources, so that $1 million fiscal note was not accurate. And then there was a $5,000 external consulting fee for coding or web development. So the point is, a lot of times people anticipate that these sites will cost much more than they actually do. So that's one objection.
What are some other reasons that public officials oppose these databases? I mean, it usually enjoys bipartisan support, so
Right.
what other reasons have been given other than costs?
Right. Again, coming back to this example of Minnesota, just because it's exemplary. So Minnesota officials and government legislators had a qualm about the technology. So that's the second problem that individuals run into. They expect that their technological system, their accounting system for keeping track of state spending is outdated and inadequate to the needs of the 21st century. The reason why I bring up Minnesota is because they've actually been able to bypass this problem. So their accounting system was put into place in 1994, and it was thought to be internet incompatible. So the question was, how will we post spending online given this antiquated accounting system? Now, as I said, the site's already well past due, but it is scheduled to be launched in late February, early March, and according, again, to NTUF's research, that will all have been done with that antiquated accounting system. So web developers and the people working on the software were able to circumvent any perceived problems, but they weren't actually existent or relevant.
Well, speaking of bipartisanship, these state transparency databases have an interesting lineage to, well, a figure that most people might know in America today. Wasn't that federal legislation that passed in, 2006, thereabouts?
Right. That's right. September 26, 2006, President George W. Bush, or past President George W. Bush, signed the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act, which was actually co-sponsored by two senators, a Republican and Democrat, Senator Coburn, and then Senator Obama, now President Obama. And so this issue does have a lineage of bipartisanship, and it should, because regardless of whether you're on the right or the left, being fiscally responsible and showing your constituents how you spend their dollars is a worthwhile endeavor.
I believe Obama said something to the effect when he was pushing this legislation that there's simply no reason to oppose transparency in government.
That's right.
So, yes.
That's right.
Okay. So what else is the NTU Foundation or NTU doing on the issue of transparency or with the Show Me the Spending website?
Mm-hmm. ShowMeTheSpending.com is really a unique endeavor. It runs on Wikipedia.org-like software technology, which means that anyone throughout the United States can edit the site. So that enables citizens, government officials, and also individuals in organizations like NTU or NTUF to modify the site to help citizens keep track of state spending or the lack of transparency about state spending in their region.
So each and every Gimme Radio listener out there today could serve as a reporter of sorts, an individual reporter who would deliver news to make this website even more up to date.
That's correct. That's correct. And the site has been viewed and praised really by the Treasurer of Nebraska, for example, Shane Osborne. We've also had some very positive feedback from the individual Curtis Loftus in South Carolina, who directs the South Carolina Transparency page. And many of these state transparency sites, or at least several of them, actually link to showmethespending.com. So it's been seen as useful not only by citizens, but also by government officials who are trying to increase transparency in their state.
And I've heard that these transparency websites kind of deliver the side benefit of helping citizens to understand that some government expenditures that may sound strange actually do have a legitimate purpose. I mean, we talk about the waste, fraud, and abuse that these websites uncover. I was reminded of this when the Missouri governor was confronted basically on some expenditures for his state online for braziers. I won't say that word again, folks, for prison officials and the like, and they later researched many of these things and found that at least some of them were legitimate.
Right. I think that's something people in the transparency movement tend to overlook. In certain instances, there may be abuse of taxpayer dollars, so monies are being spent in ways which are not prudent and not fiscally sound. But in many cases, legislators and government officials are trying to be extremely prudent, especially in the current environment. And so transparency is an excellent way for them to demonstrate to their constituents that they actually are being fiscally prudent and fiscally sound. So in those cases, I think it's actually the duty of constituents and taxpayers to praise to some extent, or at least support their representatives who are being prudent and fiscally responsible.
And if I recall, in Missouri, those ladies' unmentionables were for inmates?
I think that's correct.
Yes.
They were. And so it turned out to be a legitimate expense. But that actually brings up kind of an interesting issue related to how, the levels of transparency. So in certain instances, even if states post actual records of how they've used taxpayer dollars online, they don't post many details. So in other words, they're numbers, but those numbers lack a context. And in those cases, the government officials who have posted those expenditures online have taken a step in the right direction, but in some ways, they're actually shooting themselves in the foot by not providing that context. So in this example, had they provided that information initially, there wouldn't have been all the hullabaloo about, oh, why are we buying these things in the first place? No, if that dollar amount and the title of the store from which those garments were purchased had been put in context and in the narrative, then that would have been helpful. So that brings up another aspect of transparency.
Okay, so where can Gimme Radio listeners go to get more information?
Right, so they should visit showmethespending.com. That's showmethespending, all one word, .com. And that's a great resource for finding out more information about the level of transparency in your state, or whether your state is even transparent in the first place.
And you can even sign up for updates of a kind, correct?
That's right. Each week, the National Taxpayers Union Foundation and the coalition as a whole, this coalition, which began in April of 2007 with 4 organizations, including NTU, and now has over 40 organizations on the national and state level that have stood, and local level as well, that stand committed to transparency. This coalition sends out a weekly transparency news update. So that's a great way to stay informed about what's taking place throughout the United States.
All right, Doug Elsinati, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise on state spending transparency.
You're welcome.
Always good to have you on, and we'll see you again in a couple weeks.
And even though we heard a joke in our first segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, now we get to the angry part, our outrage of the week. And this outrage concerns an entire federal cabinet department, the Department of Homeland Security, created right after September 11 from an amalgamation of agencies spread across the federal government. It was meant to get rid of layers of bureaucracy and make officials more accountable for American security. Unfortunately, that's not the way it turned out. Fiscally, the Department of Homeland Security has been a disaster. Recently, the Government Accountability Office investigated Department of Homeland Security's 48 major investments. By major investments, we're talking millions of dollars apiece, some $12 billion for acquisitions in the most recent year. Guess what? Out of those 48 major investments requiring annual reviews, 45 were not assessed in accordance with this policy. At least 1/3 of these contracts and these major investments have reported cost growth and schedule slips and performance shortfalls. Well, no wonder if you're not even paying attention to how 45 of your 48 major projects are going, what's being spent, how it's being spent, whether it's being spent on time. No wonder you're going to have a problem. Speaking of outrageous spending at the Department of Homeland Security, we've uncovered a number of strange examples. Listen to this, folks. 45% of credit card transactions in the Department of Homeland Security's official accounts did not have the right authorization. They spent $1,030 on a beer brewing kit, $8,000 for a plasma TV that sat unused after its purchase. You also have, for example, a new entertainment liaison that the Department of Homeland Security began looking for barely a year after its formation. They advertised a director-level position in a salary range of up to $136,000 just to keep relations with the various Hollywood entities making TV shows and movies. Really, really important investment in Homeland Security there, folks. The other real problem, and this was alluded to earlier, is contract cost growth. In mid-2003, the Department of Homeland Security authorized $2 million to be spent on a new office to identify terrorist threats. Unfortunately, due to lax administration, poor milestones, lack of contract control, the total price tag zoomed to $123 million in the space of 4 years. If that isn't an insult to taxpayers, I don't know what is. And now if you're properly outraged about federal expenditures, and you're probably wondering if state and local governments are doing the same, National Taxpayers Union has a way for you to translate that outrage into action with the National Taxpayers Conference.
It'll be held June 11th through 13th at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, just outside Washington, D.C. Visit ntu.org to register for the conference. We have an early bird rate of $99 right now. Get hotel information, view speakers lists, and other latest news. Again, that's www.ntu.org. You'll be able to see a schedule and different panel issues that we're going to be sponsoring, including media training, how to start a local taxpayer group. You'll hear success stories from other state and local activists that started taxpayer groups at the local level.
So in other words, folks, this is not one of your typical talking head events where you have people at lecterns giving long-winded speeches. This is practical information you can take back to your community to start a tax revolt right in your own backyard. It's a unique opportunity, which is why we're offering this to Gimme Radio listeners at a discount, because we want as many of you to join us right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And remember, June is creeping up quickly, so it's important to take advantage of that early bird rate, make your accommodations, and plan on joining us. If you've ever wanted to be a taxpayer carrying a sign, or protesting government actions, or deciding that you're going to limit taxes in your locality, this is the event for you. And we're coming to the end of our time here on Speaking of Taxpayers. Once you've made your plans to join us in Washington, D.C. at the National Taxpayers Conference, please consider this. You have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And the way we do that is speaking of taxpayers. Join us next week for another interesting edition